What if one of the biggest plants in your garden is actually giving you less useful food per foot than a row of crops you barely notice? A garden row can look full, green, and impressive, and still be underperforming. That sounds strange, because most of us are trained to judge productivity by what we can see. A large broccoli plant looks productive. A tall kale plant looks productive. A dense wall of peas looks productive. But the plant itself is only half the story. The other half is the piece of soil it occupies. How long it occupies it, how often it gives you something you can actually eat, and how quickly that same space can produce again. Today, 15 familiar garden crops are competing for the same thing, a place in your most valuable garden row. We are not going to pretend that one crop wins in every climate, every season, or every kitchen. That would be too simple. Instead, we are going to judge each crop by the practical value it can return from the row it uses. Some will win because they turn over quickly. Some will win because you can harvest them again and again without pulling the plant. Some will surprise you because they look small but fit into the garden in ways that large crops cannot. And a few will lose ground once we add a factor that many gardeners forget to count: time. Imagine an 8-foot row in one of the best parts of your garden. Good light, decent soil, easy access to water. Now, imagine that row is empty for the moment. Before you plant anything, that space is full of possibility. You could fill it with quick roots, leafy greens, a long-season crop, a trellised crop, herbs, or a sequence of 2 or more plantings. The question is not simply, what plant can grow here? The more useful question is, what can this row produce for you over the whole season? That difference matters, because a plant can be productive and still be a poor use of your best space for your particular goals. If you love broccoli and want fresh broccoli from your own garden, then a broccoli plant can be absolutely worth the room it takes. If you barely eat radishes, the fact that they mature quickly does not make them valuable to you. And if your family uses green onions every week, a narrow strip of them may quietly earn more kitchen value than a much larger crop that gives you one dramatic harvest. So this is not a contest about which vegetable is best. It is a contest about how to think. By the end, you should be able to look at any garden row and ask better questions before you plant it. How much room will this crop use? How long will it stay? Will I harvest it once or repeatedly? What happens after it is finished? And will the food it produces actually get used in my kitchen? There are 5 tests every crop in this video has to pass. The first is space. Not crowding, not squeezing plants tighter than they need, but using appropriate spacing well. A crop that naturally fits many plants into a short section of row has a different space profile from a crop that needs a large, mature footprint. Appropriate spacing matters because crowded plants can suffer from poor airflow, competition, smaller harvests, or more disease pressure. The goal is not to cram. The goal is to understand what each crop normally asks from the row. The second test is time. This is where the ranking starts to get interesting. A crop that occupies 1 foot of row for a short period and then leaves may allow another crop to follow. A crop that occupies the same foot for much longer may still be a great value if it keeps producing while it is there. Time is not automatically a penalty. It only becomes a penalty when a crop holds valuable space without returning enough useful harvest to justify that long stay. The third test is harvest frequency. Some crops are built around one main harvest. Others can be picked leaf by leaf, stem by stem, or pod by pod over a longer period. A single harvest can still be excellent, especially when the edible portion is large and the crop fits efficiently. But repeated harvest changes the math, because the same root system and the same piece of soil can keep producing without being replanted. The fourth test is succession value. Succession planting simply means that when one crop leaves the row, another crop is ready to take its place. That could mean sowing a second quick crop, transplanting something that was started elsewhere, or shifting from a cool season crop to a warm season crop as conditions change. We are not going to assume that every gardener can fit the same number of plantings into a year. A gardener in Maine, Georgia, California, or the Pacific Northwest will not have the same planting windows. But the principle is universal. Empty soil has no harvest. The fifth test is kitchen value. This one is more personal than the others, but it may be the most important. A crop only earns real value if you use it. A huge harvest of something your household rarely eats can be less useful than a modest, steady supply of something you reach for several times a week. That is why herbs and green onions can compete in this conversation, even though they will never fill a harvest basket the way bulky roots or heads can. Keep those 5 tests in mind: space, time, harvest frequency, succession value, and kitchen value. A crop can look excellent under one test and fall behind under another. In fact, one of the crops that looks least impressive at first may become one of the strongest performers once we add time to the equation. And our first 3 crops are going to show exactly why speed can be powerful, but also why speed alone does not win. Start with radishes. If you want to understand why time matters in a garden row, radishes make the lesson obvious. They do not build a giant canopy. They do not dominate the bed. They usually occupy a relatively small amount of surface space, and the reward is hidden below the soil until the root swells. Their greatest strength is not that each individual radish is a large harvest. It is that a properly spaced row can hold many plants, and the crop can move through that space quickly compared with many larger vegetables. That quick turnover creates options. A short section of row can produce radishes and then be used again for something else, while slower crops are still developing. In cool conditions, that makes radishes one of the clearest examples of a crop that earns value through speed. They also work well as a reminder that row productivity is not only about how much foliage you see above ground. A modest-looking planting can still be doing useful work. But radishes also reveal the weakness of using speed as our only metric. The main reward is usually 1 root per plant. Once you pull it, that plant is finished. And if the weather becomes too warm, roots may become less tender, plants can bolt, and quality can decline. There is another practical limitation that no yield chart can solve. If nobody in your household wants to eat radishes, a fast row of them is not high value for you. Speed gives them a strong score for turnover, but kitchen value still decides whether that speed matters. Now compare that with bok choy. Bok choy occupies the row in a very different way. It forms a compact rosette or head, and much of that above-ground plant is useful in the kitchen. Baby bok choy can be especially attractive when your goal is to get a useful harvest from a relatively small footprint. You are not waiting for a sprawling vine or a huge plant architecture. You are building a compact package of stems and leaves. That makes bok choy look like an obvious efficiency winner. But again, time and conditions matter. Bok choy is a cool season brassica. Heat, rapidly changing day length, or other stresses can push plants toward bolting, and pests that favor brassicas can reduce the clean edible portion if they are not managed. A beautiful compact head is valuable, but it is still mostly a single main harvest when you cut the plant. So bok choy earns points for compactness and for the amount of edible material in a small plant, yet it does not automatically beat a crop that can remain in place and feed you multiple times. Then we reach lettuce, and the comparison becomes more complicated. Lettuce is not just one crop behavior. A gardener can grow heading types for a more concentrated final harvest, loose leaf types for repeated picking, baby leaves for quick use, or a mixture of approaches depending on variety and season. That flexibility is what gives lettuce such a strong row value profile. If you harvest outer leaves from suitable leaf lettuce while protecting the growing center, the same plant can contribute to several meals instead of disappearing after one cut. If you prefer whole heads, lettuce can still fit neatly into a succession system because cool season plantings can be followed by something else as weather changes. And because lettuce is a common kitchen crop for salads, sandwiches, wraps, and garnishes, the edible harvest often has high household value. There is a catch. Lettuce is not equally efficient in every month. Hot weather can cause bitterness, bolting, or reduced quality. A lettuce row that performs beautifully in cool spring or fall weather may be a poor use of premium midsummer space in a hot climate. This is a pattern we will see repeatedly. The crop is not efficient by itself. It is efficient when the crop and the season match. So, after our first 3 contenders, what have we learned? Radishes may set the pace for turnover. Bok choy can convert a compact footprint into a surprisingly substantial edible plant. Lettuce can combine compact growth with multiple harvest styles and very high kitchen usefulness. If your only goal is to clear the row quickly, radishes are hard to ignore. If you want a compact whole plant harvest, bok choy is compelling. If you want flexibility between baby leaves, repeated outer leaf harvests, and whole heads, lettuce may have the broader advantage. But this is still the easy part of the ranking, because all 3 crops can be treated as relatively quick players in the right season. The next group changes the question completely. What if the plant stays in the row longer, but keeps producing while it is there? That is where a slower crop can begin to beat a faster one. Instead of asking how quickly the soil becomes available again, we have to ask whether we even want it to become available if the crop is still giving us food. Spinach is the first crop to make that argument. Like lettuce, spinach can be grown for baby leaves or allowed to produce larger leaves, and in cool conditions it can give a remarkable amount of edible foliage from a relatively tight planting. The leaves are the product, so there is very little waiting for a hidden fruit or root to mature. As soon as the plant has enough healthy leaf area, harvest can begin according to the style you are using. The row value strength of spinach comes from density and usefulness. Many plants can occupy a relatively small area, and the harvested portion goes directly into salads, cooking, soups, eggs, pasta, smoothies, or whatever your kitchen actually uses it for. With careful picking, suitable plants can continue producing new leaves for a period rather than ending after the first harvest. Yet spinach also teaches one of the most important limitations in this entire video. It can be extremely productive in its preferred conditions and frustratingly short-lived when the weather turns against it. Increasing heat and longer days can push spinach toward bolting. Once that happens, leaf quality and the useful harvest window change quickly, so spinach can rank near the top during a cool window while falling sharply during hot weather. If you judge the crop without judging the season, you miss the real picture. Kale approaches repeat harvest from the opposite direction. A mature kale plant occupies more space and stays in the garden longer. If we were penalizing crops only for time, kale would immediately lose points. But that would be unfair because the plant can keep paying rent, so to speak. When you harvest older outer leaves and leave the growing point intact, the center continues producing new foliage. One plant can contribute to meal after meal over a long period when conditions and plant health cooperate. That long harvest window is exactly why time has to be interpreted, not merely counted. A plant that stays for months and produces regularly can be a better use of space than a crop that leaves quickly but is followed by nothing. On the other hand, a kale plant that your household rarely eats can occupy valuable row space for a long time without delivering much practical kitchen value. Again, the garden cannot decide that for you. Your cooking habits have to be part of the ranking. Kale also has a mature footprint that is difficult to ignore. It is not the plant you squeeze into every tiny gap. As it grows, it casts shade and competes for root space. That can be an advantage if you deliberately plan around it, but it means kale's strong repeat harvest score comes with a real space cost. It earns that space by continuing to produce, not by being small. Swiss chard may be the most interesting member of this repeat harvest group because it combines a fairly substantial plant with a long period of leaf production. Like kale, chard can be harvested from the outside while the center continues to grow. The broad leaves and thick petioles create useful kitchen volume, and chard can tolerate warmer conditions than crops such as spinach often prefer. That can extend its practical value across parts of the season when other leafy greens struggle. But Swiss chard is not a tiny crop. Mature plants can become broad, and that width has to be respected. If you crowd them simply because you want more plants per foot, you can reduce the very productivity you were trying to increase. The better strategy is to give each plant appropriate room and then take advantage of the fact that it can return harvests repeatedly from that footprint. This is the first major shift in our ranking. The fast crops taught us that a row can produce value by finishing quickly. Spinach, kale, and Swiss chard teach us that a row can also produce value by never really stopping while the crop remains healthy. That means the best system may not be the one with the most replanting. Sometimes the most efficient thing you can do is leave a productive plant exactly where it is. And now the comparison becomes harder, because our next crops do not advertise their harvest above the soil. Much of their value develops underground, and several of them can fit many edible roots into a row that would hold only a few large leafy plants. This is where density begins to challenge repeat harvest. Carrots are a perfect example of why a plant's visible size can mislead you. Above ground, the foliage is relatively narrow and airy compared with a mature brassica. Below ground, each plant is building a storage route. When carrots establish well in loose, suitable soil, a row can support many individual roots without the broad canopy required by larger crops. That gives carrots a strong space efficiency argument. But carrots do not win on speed the way radishes do. They ask for patience. Germination and early establishment can be slower and less forgiving. And poor soil structure, crusting, rocks, inconsistent moisture, or competition from weeds can reduce the quality of the roots you finally harvest. A theoretical row full of carrots is not useful if the stand never establishes evenly. This is why real garden efficiency has to include reliability under your conditions, not just what looks good on paper. Carrots also tend to be a single harvest crop at the individual plant level. Once you pull a root, that plant is done. You can harvest the row gradually rather than all at once, but you are still consuming the plant itself. Their value comes from fitting many edible units into the row, and from the fact that carrots are extremely versatile in the kitchen. If your household uses carrots constantly, that kitchen value can easily justify the longer wait. Beets add another layer to the calculation, because they can offer more than one edible portion. The swollen root is the obvious harvest, but beet greens are edible too. That does not mean you should strip the plant of all its leaves while expecting a large root. The leaves are the plant's solar panels, and the root depends on them. But modest harvesting of suitable outer greens, or using the tops at final harvest, can increase the percentage of the crop that reaches the kitchen. That whole crop usefulness is important. When we talk about yield, we often picture weight or volume. But another form of efficiency is how much of the healthy plant can become food. A beet can contribute greens and later a root. If your kitchen enjoys both, that is a different value profile from a crop where only one small portion is normally eaten. Beets also offer flexibility in harvest size. You can pull smaller roots earlier or leave others longer, which means the row does not have to switch from full to empty in a single day. That can help you manage kitchen supply and make room gradually. Still, beets remain a crop whose main payoff requires the plant to leave the ground. Their repeat value is limited, compared with a kale or chard plant that can continue producing without being removed. Turnips push the same idea toward faster cool season turnover. Like beets, turnips can provide edible roots and edible greens, depending on the variety and how you use them. Some gardeners grow turnips largely for the roots, others appreciate the tops, and some use both. That flexibility can make the crop surprisingly valuable per section of row. Turnips also show why a single harvest crop does not automatically lose to a cut-and-come-again crop. If a root crop fits efficiently, matures in a useful window, gives you a high percentage of edible material, and then leaves early enough for another planting, the same row can remain productive even though no individual plant is harvested twice. The repeated productivity belongs to the soil rather than to the plant. Now, compare these three with the leafy crops we just discussed. A carrot row may hold many individual edible roots, but asks you to wait. Beets can give you greens plus roots, increasing whole plant usefulness. Turnips can combine useful density with relatively quick cool season production. None offers the long, repeated leaf harvest of Swiss chard, but all can convert a narrow strip of soil into a concentrated harvest. This is where many gardeners are tempted to create a simple ranking and call it finished. Maybe fast crops at the top, repeat harvest greens next, root crops after that. But that would miss the factor that can reverse several positions on the board. The missing factor is what happens after harvest. Picture two identical 4-foot sections of row. In the first, a quick crop is harvested, and the soil sits empty for the next 6 weeks because the gardener has not prepared anything to follow it. In the second, the quick crop is harvested, and a new planting takes over almost immediately. The first row had a fast crop. The second row had a fast system. Those are not the same thing. This is the empty row penalty. It is not a formal scientific measurement. It is simply a useful way to notice lost opportunity. An empty garden bed is not producing food. Sometimes that empty period is intentional and sensible. You may be resting the bed, managing disease, preparing soil, waiting for weather to change, or simply choosing not to keep every space planted. Gardening is not a factory, and your goal does not have to be maximum output every day of the year. But if your stated goal is more food from the same garden, then unplanned empty time matters. Succession planting is how you reduce that empty time when conditions allow. The concept is simple. As one crop finishes, another begins. The second crop might be sown directly into the space. It might be a transplant started elsewhere, so it can take over quickly. Or it might be a different seasonal crop selected because the weather has changed. The exact sequence depends on climate, day length, frost dates, heat, soil conditions, and the crops you actually want to eat. This changes the way we judge radishes immediately. Their value is not merely that they are fast. Their real value appears when their speed creates room for something useful next. It changes how we judge lettuce too. A spring lettuce planting can be valuable not only for the leaves it provides, but also because the bed can transition as warmer weather arrives, and it changes how we judge a long-lived crop like kale. Kale may occupy the row for a long time, but if it keeps producing steadily, it may avoid the empty row penalty entirely. So now we are no longer asking which plant is most productive in isolation. We are asking what that foot of garden can do over time. That is a much more useful question, because the row is the resource you are trying to manage. The plant is only one temporary user of it. This new rule also gives an advantage to crops that can fit around the edges of a larger plan, rather than demanding center stage. That brings us to 3 quieter contenders: kohlrabi, green onions, and parsley. None has the dramatic reputation of a giant cabbage, a heavy tomato plant, or a basket of squash. But efficiency is often built from crops that quietly turn overlooked space into something useful. Kohlrabi is the first of those surprises. It belongs to the brassica family, but instead of waiting for a large head like cabbage or broccoli, you harvest a swollen stem that develops above the soil. The plant still has a leafy canopy and needs appropriate spacing, so it is not a miniature crop that can be packed without limits. But compared with some larger brassicas, kohlrabi can offer a fairly compact edible centerpiece. Its leaves are edible as well, which adds whole plant value if you use them. Again, that does not mean removing so much foliage that you interfere with the plant's ability to grow. Think of the leaves as a bonus rather than a reason to repeatedly strip the plant. Kohlrabi's main efficiency argument is that it can deliver a substantial edible stem without requiring the same mature footprint or long wait associated with some larger heading brassicas. Its weakness is familiar. It is primarily a one-plant, one-main harvest system. Once you cut the swollen stem, that individual crop is effectively finished. And like other cool season brassicas, heat and pest pressure can change performance. Kohlrabi earns space by being relatively compact and useful, not by producing indefinitely. Green onions are almost the opposite. They rarely create the dramatic moment that makes a gardener stop and take a photograph. A row of green onions can look modest. The plants are narrow. The harvest from any one plant is small, and there is no giant head or root to reveal. Yet that modest appearance hides an important advantage. Narrow plants can use linear space extremely efficiently. Green onions can be harvested as needed rather than all at once. You can pull individual plants from a group, allowing the rest to continue. And because the plants are so slender, they can sometimes fit into edges or narrow spaces that would be awkward for a larger crop. That does not mean they should be forced into the root zones of other plants without thought. Competition still exists, but as a crop category, They are unusually good at turning small amounts of row frontage into something the kitchen uses frequently. And frequency matters. If you add green onions to eggs, soups, noodles, salads, tacos, stir-fries, potatoes, or garnishes throughout the week, a small planting can create a steady stream of practical value. The total weight may never impress you, but the number of meals touched by that planting can be high. This is exactly why kitchen value belongs in our 5 tests. Parsley makes the same argument even more strongly. Nobody grows parsley because they expect to fill a wheelbarrow. You grow it because a small amount can transform a dish, and because the plant can be harvested over time. Once established, healthy parsley can provide repeated cuts of outer stems while the center continues growing. That turns a relatively compact plant into a long-term kitchen resource. Parsley also exposes a weakness in any ranking based only on pounds. If you measured parsley against carrots by weight, carrots would likely look far more productive. But if you measure how often a small planting provides exactly what a recipe needs, parsley can look extremely efficient. The correct metric depends on the job you want the garden to do. This is why there is no honest, universal winner. A gardener who wants calories, storage routes, or bulk vegetables will rank these crops differently from someone who wants fresh flavor every day. But if our goal is to make every foot useful, green onions and parsley deserve far more attention than their small harvest baskets suggest. And now we reach the final 3 challenges, each of which attacks our system from a different direction. Broccoli asks whether one large, premium harvest can justify a broad footprint and a longer stay. Peas ask whether the row can become more productive by moving growth upward. Cilantro asks whether a crop with a tendency to bolt can still earn exceptional value through fast, repeated succession. One is large, one is vertical, and one is fleeting. Together, they will tell us whether our 5 tests actually hold up. Broccoli is where this entire conversation becomes uncomfortable, because broccoli looks like productivity. A healthy plant can be broad, vigorous, and visually impressive. When the central head forms well, the harvest feels substantial and rewarding. For many gardeners, cutting a fresh broccoli head from the garden is exactly the kind of payoff that makes vegetable gardening worth the effort. But broccoli pays for that payoff with space and time. A mature plant needs room for leaves to spread and for roots to support the head. It does not fit into a row the way green onions or carrots do. And compared with radishes, lettuce, or other quick cool season crops, it occupies that room for a longer period before the main reward arrives. Does that make broccoli inefficient? Not automatically. This is where a simple pounds per foot mindset would be misleading. Broccoli has high kitchen value for many households. And after the central head is harvested, many types can produce smaller side shoots if conditions remain favorable. Those secondary harvests can extend the value of the plant beyond the first cut. If you love broccoli and your climate gives it a strong growing window, that continuing production can justify the footprint. But if your broccoli struggles with heat, pests, or poor timing and gives you one small head after holding premium row space for a long time, the value calculation changes quickly. Broccoli is therefore one of the best examples of a crop that can be fantastic in the right system and disappointing in the wrong one. It does not deserve to be called a space waster. It deserves to be judged honestly against what your garden could have produced in the same place. That brings us to peas. And peas change the geometry of the row. Most of the crops so far have used horizontal space in an obvious way. Peas still need soil along the row, but their stems can climb a trellis and move much of the plant upward. Suddenly, the question is not only how much row length a crop occupies, it is also how effectively the crop uses vertical space above that row. This vertical habit is a real advantage in a garden where sunlight and trellis placement allow it. A relatively narrow line of roots can support vines that rise above the bed, and those vines can produce pods over repeated pickings. You are not pulling the entire plant to harvest each pod. For a period, the row keeps returning food while the productive surface of the plant expands upward rather than outward. There are trade-offs. Peas prefer cooler conditions, and production declines when temperatures move beyond what the plants tolerate well. They need support, which adds setup, and can create shade that affects neighboring crops, depending on orientation. And when the pea season ends, the vines must be cleared before the space transitions. Still, peas earn a strong row value score because they use a dimension that carrots, beets, and broccoli cannot height. Then there is cilantro, a crop that many gardeners have a complicated relationship with. Cilantro can seem frustrating because it often moves from leafy growth toward flowering faster than people expect, especially as conditions become warmer or days lengthen. If you planted one large block and expected it to behave like parsley for months, that quick transition might feel like failure. But our row value framework lets us see a different possibility. Cilantro does not have to be treated as a permanent resident. It can be treated as a succession crop. Instead of expecting one planting to supply leaves indefinitely, you can sow smaller amounts at intervals when the season is appropriate. One planting is used while the next is developing. The very trait that seems like a weakness, a relatively quick life cycle, can become part of a planned turnover system. Cilantro also has multiple kitchen stages. The fresh leaves are the familiar harvest, but if plants are allowed to flower and set mature seed, those seeds are coriander. Whether you choose to let plants reach that stage depends on your goals and how much space you want to dedicate to it. But it shows that the crop's usefulness does not necessarily end the moment leafy harvest declines. In a household that uses cilantro frequently, the kitchen value can be extremely high because a small amount has a strong culinary effect. In a household that dislikes cilantro, the exact same row could have almost no value. There may be no crop in our list that demonstrates the personal side of productivity more clearly. Now, all 15 crops have passed through the same basic questions. We have seen fast roots, compact heads, repeated leafy harvests, dense underground crops, narrow alliums, long-lived herbs, a large brassica, a climber, and a short-lived herb that rewards succession. So which one actually grows the most food per foot? The honest answer starts with a distinction. There is no single winner until you decide what kind of productivity you mean. If you mean fastest turnover, radishes remain one of the strongest choices in the entire group. Their power comes from finishing quickly enough that the row can do something else. But that advantage only becomes meaningful when you actually use the space afterward. A radish row, followed by nothing, is simply a fast crop and an empty bed. A radish row followed by lettuce, beans, greens, or another seasonally appropriate crop becomes part of a productive sequence. Bok choy also scores strongly for fast, compact production, especially when grown at a size and season that suit your conditions. It delivers a substantial edible plant from a modest footprint, but the main head is still largely a one-time harvest. Lettuce gains ground because it can behave in more than one way. It can be grown for heads, baby leaves, or repeated outer leaf picking, and it fits naturally into succession planning. For a household that uses lettuce constantly, that combination of flexibility and kitchen demand is hard to beat. So for fast row return, radishes and lettuce form a very strong pair, with bok choy close behind when cool conditions cooperate. Radish wins the argument for pure speed. Lettuce makes the stronger argument for versatility. For repeated harvest value, the competition shifts to spinach, kale, and Swiss chard. Spinach can be extraordinarily efficient during cool weather because a dense planting turns sunlight into edible leaves quickly, and the leaves can be harvested at different sizes. But its window can close rapidly when heat and long days trigger bolting. Kale trades compactness for endurance. It needs more room, but it can remain useful for a long period and keep producing leaves from the center while older outer leaves are removed. If your household eats kale regularly, that long season can justify the footprint. If it does not, the same endurance becomes a liability because valuable space remains committed to a crop you are not using. Swiss chard may offer the best balance of repeat harvest and seasonal durability in many gardens. It is not small, and it deserves appropriate spacing, but the plant can keep replacing harvested outer leaves for a long period. Its tolerance for warmer conditions than spinach often extends the practical harvest window. That makes Swiss chard one of our strongest overall repeat harvest contenders, especially for gardeners who actually cook with it. For root crop row value, carrots, beets, and turnips each win a different argument. Carrots are powerful because the edible roots can be arranged efficiently along a row, and because their kitchen uses are broad. Beets gain value when both roots and greens are appreciated. Turnips can offer useful cool season turnover and, like beets, can provide more than one edible portion. If your soil is deep, loose, and well suited to straight roots, carrots may give you the strongest combination of density and kitchen versatility. If you value edible tops as well as roots, beets and turnips become much more competitive. If your soil repeatedly produces poor carrots, however, theoretical density does not matter. The best crop is the one your actual soil can support reliably. For small footprint kitchen value, green onions, parsley, and cilantro deserve their own category because weight is the wrong way to judge them. Green onions can fit into narrow spaces and be harvested individually as needed. Parsley can remain in place and provide repeated small cuts over a long period. Cilantro can produce a rapid sequence of fresh leaves when you plan successive sowings rather than expecting one planting to last. Of those three, green onions may be the easiest to recognize as a row efficiency winner because the plants are so narrow and so broadly useful in cooking. Parsley may win for long repeated harvest from individual plants. Cilantro may win for turnover in kitchens that use it constantly. None needs to fill a basket to justify its space. For vertical row value, peas are the clear winner in this particular list because they are the crop that most deliberately moves productive growth upward. They still require a season that suits them and a trellis that fits your garden. But repeated pod harvest from a narrow supported row is exactly the kind of space conversion we are looking for. And broccoli? Broccoli does not win our efficiency categories, but that does not make it a loser. It belongs in a different conversation. High-value crops that may justify a larger footprint because the harvest itself matters to you. If you love fresh broccoli, grow broccoli. The goal of a productive garden is not to eliminate every crop that fails a mathematical efficiency test. The goal is to understand the trade you are making. But if you do want to maximize food from limited row space, some patterns are now clear. Crops become stronger candidates when they do at least two of these things well. Fit efficiently, mature in a useful window, allow repeated harvest, release space in time for another crop, or provide unusually high kitchen value. The strongest crops often do 3 or 4 of those things at once. Lettuce is a good example. It can fit relatively efficiently, offer multiple harvest styles, move through cool season windows, and get used frequently. Swiss chard is another. It occupies more room, but repeated harvest and a long productive window can compensate for that footprint. Green onions are another, because narrow growth and high kitchen frequency create value without demanding a large block. Peas earn their place by combining repeated picking with vertical growth. Radishes earn theirs by turning over quickly enough to make succession easy to imagine. Imagine the same 8-foot row again. Instead of asking which single crop deserves all 8 feet for the entire season, divide the season in your mind. What can use that row in cool spring weather? What can follow when those crops finish? Which plants can remain because they keep producing? Which sections can be replanted? Which crops can go upward so the ground stays available for another layer of planting where competition and light allow it? That is when a row stops being a static strip of soil and becomes a timeline. A static garden plan says, carrots go here, kale goes there, broccoli goes there. A productive timeline says, this section starts with a quick, cool season crop, transitions to another crop when the weather changes, and perhaps returns to greens when temperatures fall again. Another section holds chard for a long harvest window. A trellis carries peas during their season, and then supports something different later if your climate allows. The exact sequence is yours, but the thinking is what creates the game. And this is also where restraint matters. More productivity does not mean forcing a crop into every exposed inch. Plants need light, root room, airflow, water, and nutrients. Interplanting or tighter spacing only works when the crops and spacing are appropriate. Crowding can reduce yields, increase disease pressure, complicate harvest, and turn a beautifully planned row into a competitive mess. The goal is not maximum plant count, It is maximum useful production from healthy plants. Water matters too. Dense leafy crops can create a large demand during active growth, while long-season crops keep using water for longer periods. Soil fertility matters because repeated harvest removes nutrients from the garden. A bed that produces crop after crop needs organic matter, appropriate fertility management, and attention to soil structure. You cannot ask the same foot of soil to keep producing indefinitely without taking care of the soil itself. This is especially true across the United States because the phrase garden season means very different things in different places. A cool season crop that thrives for months in one region may have only a short window in another. A gardener with mild winters may use fall and winter successions that are impossible in colder zones without protection. Someone in a northern climate may value every warm week differently. That is why the ranking should guide your questions, not dictate your calendar. So, what should you do with all of this the next time you stand in front of an empty row? Start with what you actually eat. Cross off the crops that your household does not want, no matter how efficient somebody says they are. Then, look at your season. Which of the remaining crops truly fit the weather window ahead? Next, look at the mature footprint and give the plants the spacing they need rather than the spacing you wish they needed. Then ask whether the crop will be harvested once or repeatedly. Finally, decide what happens after it leaves. That last question is the one most likely to change your harvest. What happens next? If the answer is nothing, and the weather could support another crop, you may be leaving production on the table. If the answer is another planned planting, that foot of soil has a second job. If the answer is that the existing crop will keep producing for weeks or months, then leaving it in place may be the most efficient decision of all. This turns the 5 tests into a simple habit: space, time, harvest frequency, succession value, kitchen value. You do not need a calculator. You do not need to weigh every leaf. You do not need a complicated spreadsheet. You just need to stop judging productivity by plant size alone. A giant plant can be a fantastic use of space if it feeds you repeatedly or gives you a harvest you deeply value. A tiny crop can be a poor use of space if you never eat it. A fast crop can be inefficient if the bed sits empty afterward. A slow crop can be efficient if it keeps producing the entire time. A vertical crop can multiply the usefulness of a narrow row, but only if the trellis, sun, and season are right. The context is the productivity. Ask it before you plant broccoli. Ask it before you dedicate a long row to carrots. Ask it when lettuce starts to bolt. Ask it when radishes come out. Ask it when your peas finish. Ask it when Swiss chard is still sending up new leaves while another bed is empty. The question does not tell you what to grow. It tells you to notice the opportunity cost of the space. And when you begin noticing that, the garden starts to look different. Empty gaps become planting windows. Long-lived greens become productive anchors. Quick roots become bridges between bigger crops. Herbs stop looking insignificant because you recognize how often they reach the kitchen. Trellises become a way to use height, not just a support. Even the decision to leave a crop in place becomes more deliberate because you know what it is earning while it stands. That is the real payoff of thinking in yield per foot. It is not a race to squeeze more plants into the bed. It is a way to make each planting decision more intentional. So if your garden feels like it should be producing more, do not assume the answer is another raised bed, another load of soil, or a larger plot. First, look at the rows you already have. Look for long periods when useful space sits empty. Look for crops that stay a long time but give you very little because you do not use them. Look for vegetables you love that can be harvested repeatedly. Look for quick crops that can open a second planting window. Look for vertical crops that can move growth upward. And look for the small herbs and alliums that quietly contribute to meal after meal. The biggest lesson is not that lettuce is better than broccoli, or that radishes are better than carrots, or that Swiss chard should replace kale. The lesson is that every foot of garden has a cost in both space and time. A crop earns that cost in different ways. It may finish quickly, it may keep producing, it may fit tightly, it may grow upward. It may provide more than one edible part, or it may simply be so useful in your kitchen that every harvest matters. Do not ask only, how much does this plant produce? Ask, what could this foot of soil produce across the whole season? That one question can completely change the way you plan a vegetable garden. And you may discover that you do not need a bigger garden at all. You may only need the garden you already have to spend less time empty, less time growing food you do not use, and more time producing the crops that earn their place every time you walk outside to harvest.